which is now up on Canvas and will be due on Friday, right? And that way I'll get it back to you over the weekend, and you'll have it the final due next. But the one after that should be coming up pretty quickly as well, and then you'll be free of all of that and focusing only on your research paper. But with both of the last two movement essays, I'll be doing the peer edit so that you can continue to focus on your research paper, right? But you still have to write these, though, right? So Dada is up. We should maybe barely get to Dada today, start to touch on it. As I said, we're running woefully behind. We'll probably make it through pop art, I would imagine, by the end last 5 weeks of class. But again, we'll see how that always things slow down a bit, right? So we were looking at the Bauhaus, this German architectural school, design school that was established in the immediate aftermath of World War I to help rebuild Germany after the war. And this was something that was really an issue all over Europe, was the idea of trying to rebuild the war-torn continent in a more efficient way by wedding design to industry. And the Bauhaus is the most prominent example, but there was a group of people in France that were doing very much the same thing, also up in England, although in England it wasn't as ravaged, right, as it was on the continent. So the Bauhaus was embracing machine-based forms, trying to understand those materials better so that they could design architecture and everything that goes inside of it. Because the idea toward architecture was that it's not just a building, it's an environment that you're creating, right? That's one attitude. The other attitude, which is the Bauhaus mantra, is that form follows function, right? That it was a very functional kind of architecture. We spent a long time on Friday talking about the Bauhaus as a functional building, or a series of buildings, each of which looks slightly different based on its function. Because of the interest in industrial materials in construction, it should come as no great surprise that the constructivists were very popular there, because they had already been doing this. They'd already been interested in the nature of materials, the nature of industrial materials, and making compositions where the forms of the composition were in fact based on the materials that they used for that composition. Think of Lissitzky's Prown constructions, for example. And the way in which Kandinsky at this point goes toward a more architectonic kind of abstraction. Moholy-Nagy, making these, again, very architectonic kind of compositions, but even though they're painted suggesting constructed materials in space, right down to sort of press board peg sheets, you know. These were very, very attractive to the leaders of the Bauhaus, particularly Walter Gropius. And he hired a number of these prominent constructivists to come and teach at the Bauhaus. So Kandinsky arrives in 1921, Moholy-Nagy right around the same time. Both of them are there to teach the Bauhaus students. So what we were looking at on Friday was the fact that this interest in materials, this focused interest in the nature of materials, also had the byproduct of a focused interest in technique. How do you handle those materials, right? And the Bauhaus curriculum had specific classes in mastering each of the different materials you might need to master to be a designer or an architect. Classes in wood. Just you take a class in wood, right? See what you can do with it. Take a class in metals. Take a class in glass, right? In addition to other classes in color and 2D design and whatnot, right? And this interest in exploiting technique, right? Using technique to exploit materials, leads many of the constructivist artists during their Bauhaus phase to become particularly inventive about the potentials of each technique and explore what had traditionally been done with those and find something new based on this is what that technique does. And so this is how we get to Moholy-Nagy's photograms, where he understands the process of photography, which is light shining on a photosensitive piece of paper, being blocked out in certain parts, usually by a negative, right? Creating a photograph. And he realizes that, and he says, well, why don't I just lay stuff directly on the photosensitive paper and then turn on the lights, see what happens, right? So we become these artists who become very, very much interested in sort of doing something radically different and new with traditional techniques, right? And then we also saw a sort of interest in these sort of mechano men, which we saw with the constructivists as well, the sort of robotics and whatnot. Now, they're not using the word robotics yet, and the word robot, I remembered his name, Stanislav Lem. Hey, Fadi, could you shut the door? They're doing some construction in the hall, and they've been pounding and grinding all day. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So there became this interest in sort of mechano men, with the idea of, again, that life is wed to industry, right? And so Oskar Schlemmer is another of the artists that's hired to come to the Bauhaus. He's not really a constructivist per se, but he does share certain things with them. There's the metallized paint for one of the figures, these mechanical figures that we saw Liszewski doing. And he becomes also in charge of the Bauhaus Theater Company, right? And we begin to see a number of these images of Bauhaus people in costume, left over from their Halloween parties, he'd written this thing called the Triadic Ballet, where they dressed up as machines. And so here's one of the Bauhaus students. We'd have no idea which one. I'm sure somebody could probably figure out who she is based on her dress. But seated in one of Marcel Breuer's most iconic chairs from the Bauhaus period. They still sell this. You can still buy a Vasily armchair, where it's bent steel tubing. Breuer had seen a bicycle and thought, that's it, bent metal. We can make chairs out of bent metal, right? Because it's sturdy. After seeing the bicycle, and began then to use the sort of construction you see in a bicycle to come up with this chair that it suspends around that metal frame, and then has, in this case, it looks like cloth, but primarily it's usually leather bands in between, right? And it almost looks like a De-Style sort of construction, because everything seems to float in space. And there certainly is a lot of overlap. In fact, the De-Style people contacted the Bauhaus people at one point to try to get together to make it all work, as one group. But then wearing this preposterous mask, right? Part of me wonders if the dress itself isn't also a Bauhaus design, because there were some Bauhaus textile people. Goethe Stotzel is one of them, and that looks kind of like some of the Bauhaus textiles that I've seen, right? But Breuer became sort of the thing that did come out of the Bauhaus, even if they didn't ever really build much of anything other than the school itself, right? And a few other buildings for exhibitions. But what did come out of it were these fantastic designs where they took their principle of understanding the nature of materials, manipulating those materials in a new way, but also then, like what we saw when we talked about minimal painting, being very careful about those materials and what materials you choose, because if you're going to pare down your traditional forms, then what's left better be good. So the metal that you use better be chromed, right? And well chromed, because otherwise it's going to look ugly. The chair caning better be just so. So you've probably seen this before, in auditoriums and whatnot. It's because these can be mass produced, right? Because they're designed for the machine. They're designed for mass production. So the B32 Tone chair is still in production, right? The Vasily chair is still in production. The Tone you can get relatively inexpensively, because I think even IKEA sells a crappy version of it, right? The Vasily chair is going to set you back, right? Quite a bit. In fact, you can go up to the building museum and buy a little toy version this big for like $400. The license, I know. I saw it there and I thought, yay, this goes in my office. And I picked it up and I put it right back down again because I couldn't. The designs that came out of the Bauhaus were just fantastic, though. And in many ways, these set the tone for modern design. And these things might look familiar to you now. But in the 20s, right, these were rather groundbreaking because they don't look like traditional homey stuff. They look like industrial designs. And so taking geometry, right, simplified geometry, and using that as the basis for the design is, in fact, was at the heart of the Bauhaus, right? And this is what they adopted from the constructivists. So Wagenfeld's table lamps, right? And they all had these very industrial names, B32, WA24 table lamps, are sort of part and parcel of what you buy at IKEA these days, you know? But that's where they're getting it from, is that simplified aesthetic that can be mass-produced on the cheap, right? What the Bauhaus did with these prototypes was not mass-produce them, but make the prototype with the nicest quality materials they could, right? So they look better than the junk you'd buy down at Home Depot, right? And I thought, since even though we didn't have any buildings, it's worthwhile looking at some of these. Marion Brandt came up with a series of amazing designs, and I think they're just so purified and clean, right? And understanding of proportions, everything down to just the little on-off switch on the base, but how the base itself is handled. I love this. Like, I'd own that, right? This amazing teapot, and again, made with very high-quality materials. This, I believe it's Bakelite half handle, right? That's heat-resistant on this brass teapot that's much nicer brass than anything that you or I would probably own, you know, highly polished. But again, applying very simplified geometric forms sort of to everything that we see. Right? These are hallmarks of Bauhaus design. And it's the application of constructivism to design principles. Right? That's the long and the short of it, is that when Kandinsky, Moholy-Nagy arrive in the early 20s, they bring these ideas, and it helps the Bauhaus to move out of a theoretical phase early on, where they're really just learning about sort of metaphysics of color and whatnot, into actually getting some stuff done. Right? Now, I wanted to look at one last Bauhaus artist before we leave it behind and move back into Expressionism, and that's Lionel Feininger. He was an American. His parents were German. They had expated to America in the 19th century. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, Feininger goes back to Germany and spends the rest of his career in Germany. Right? So this is, as you can probably tell, very, very Cubist work, isn't it? It's really similar to Cubism in a lot of ways. Maybe even purist, right? In the way that you have that concentration of elements in the upper right corner, and then it seems to open up along the lines of the golden section away from that, right? And we've seen how much Cubism really did have an impact on pretty much everybody in Europe, right? The Cubist revolution. And Feininger in Germany is also picking up on this. Now, he's a member of the Bauhaus, right? He's one of the original members. In fact, I think Lionel Feininger was the only one who was with the Bauhaus all the way from its inception to the time that Hitler closed it, right, in 1932. Even Walter Gropius, the first head of the Bauhaus, eventually left, right? Feininger is the only one that's always there. And in this case, he's giving us this Cubist rendering of a church tower in the town of Zerkau. And he painted it a number of different times, at least 7, right? And I think it's more like 8 or 9 times that he painted it. Now, it's Cubist in a sort of a Juan Gris fashion. It's got a lot more color. But again, in the 1918s, right, late teens, even Picasso and Braque have gone back to color, right, and brought that into their Cubist works. But prior to joining the Bauhaus, Feininger was kind of all over the map, right? He was soaking up all of these European modern movements. Who's he picking up on here? action, movement, speed. The futurist, right? Very much so. And the fact that he, even though he repeats different bicyclists, right? The way in which he set them down suggests this sort of mechanized movement and speed, which is a hallmark of futurism. So he's sort of in that orbit of cubo-futurists that we've seen a lot of people falling into, right? After the futurists begin around 1911, 1912, we see a lot of ours sort of fall over to this thing where they're trying to take cubism and make something much more dynamic out of it, right? And Feininger is falling into that as well. A more recent acquisition from the National Gallery, the Street of Barns, also by Feininger, showing again how he fits really very specifically into this cubo-futurist grouping, right? And others that fit into that we've seen sort of all over the place, right? So Feininger was there from the start, and he was actually tapped by Gropius to design a woodcut for the cover of the Bauhaus Manifesto. Now, we've talked a lot about manifestos, right? Whenever groups stick together, very often there'll be a written proclamation of their intent, right? Futurist had one. Cubists didn't really. Fauves didn't, right? But there was one for the Blue Rider. There was one for the Die Brücke, right? Well, here's the cover for the Bauhaus Manifesto in 1919, designed and carved by Feininger. So it's against in woodblock, one of the oldest German materials, and we've seen the degree to which German artists are interested in that heritage, right? Going back to the first expressionists we looked at, Katie Kollwitz, right? Kirchner, the degree to which they're really looking back to this sort of primitive German heritage, and by primitive they mean Renaissance, right? But for them, older German heritage. And Feininger, very much the same thing, right? The Bauhaus cover. And you'll notice that in addition to being an old medium, woodcut, it's also an old building, a cathedral, right? It's the same, it's based on Zerkow. So it's the same cathedral he'd been painting all along, right? And what better thing for the Bauhaus than a cathedral, right? A modern temple, if you will, right? A temple to the arts. And a cathedral being the place in the Bauhaus mindset where the one place where their ideas had already taken place. The idea that everything within the building is part of the building. Not just the solid structure, but the windows, right? Stained glass. Yeah? The pews, right? The furniture within it is part of it. And there was a strong belief from the 19th century onward that a Gothic cathedral took its form out of functionalism. That all of the elements that look decorative to us in a Gothic cathedral are there because they fulfill a particular structural form. Flying buttresses, right? Even gargoyles were thought to like abut the thrust of the building, right? So for the Bauhaus, there's this kind of interesting thing. They're all about modernism. They're all about industry, right? Wedding industry for mass production. But on the other hand, they're also all about craft and the importance of the hand of the artist within that craft. And so there's always this sort of almost a paradox between the industrial side of the Bauhaus and this sort of medieval craftsmanship side. Right? They even, Gropius, as he writes up the manifesto, when you read it, it sort of sounds, he modeled it basically after medieval guild laws, right? About how we're going to get together and work with our hands and develop a style that's particular for this period, right? All comes out of medieval guild regulations. So it's this interesting paradox, right? And knowing that within the Bauhaus you had not only this group of constructivists, but you also had a group of expressionists, right? Who are getting back to that handcraft idea. Is an important element of what made the Bauhaus really work so well. And it brings us to our next section as we move now into a new kind of expressionism. So again, I have this just to reiterate what I was just saying, right? My words are ahead of my notes, if you will, my slideshow. That it's important to remember that there was this strong undercurrent of expressionism at the Bauhaus, that the Bauhaus is German art after the war, but it's not the only trend of German art after the war, right? And that with Germany, prior to the war, we had seen expressionism be the dominant artistic trend. And this is definitely true through the war and after the war as well. And that even at the Bauhaus, as committed as it is to constructivist ideals and architecture, has an expressionist side as well. Okay? So keep that in the back of your mind, that it's not solely constructivist. Jamie. What's that?
What city was this in?
I didn't. Bauhaus, it started off in Weimar, which was the capital of the Weimar Republic. And then there was a change in, this is a long story, I'll give you the really short version, but there was a change in the local government. The Weimar, just after the war, the Weimar Republic, okay, was named after the city of the capital of the Weimar Republic, in Weimar. W-E-I-M-A-R, Weimar in Germany, right? And it was, after the war, it was a fairly liberal-minded government, right? Very progressive. And in 1924, the local elections shifted the politics to be much more conservative. And they drove the Bauhaus out of Weimar. Now, while they were in Weimar, they had a building that had been given to them from the 19th century. So we don't ever look at it because it's this boring old 1900 building, right? And at that point, Gropius picks up and moves the entire group, 1925, to Dessau, D-E-S-S-A-U. Which has a more, Germany's much more fragmented, I guess not unlike us this way, right? Local governments kind of set the tenor. At least at this point in his history, this is going to change, right? This is before Hitler. Okay. So he moves to Dessau, where it's much more liberal and where they're more open. But again, that's eventually, by the end of the 20s, as the Nazi Party rises in power, right, up to their election to government in 1932, right? Up until that point, Dessau's looking pretty liberal, but then going increasingly.
Are these big cities or just kind of?
I've never been, but I think they're big-ish. I mean, they're not like Paris and Berlin big, but they're substantial. Yes, exactly right. And also the thing about big is that we tend to use that term in modern standards. Like, how big was DC in 1925? Right? So, DC is a big city, right? But how big was it in 1925? It was still considered a major city. These are major cities, right? That's a better way of putting it than big, right? They're important. They're large and important cities, right? Okay, so we're going to be looking at expressionism and looking at other trends of expressionism outside the Bauhaus, right? Feininger represents for us a leg of expressionism that was in the Bauhaus, right? But there were expressionists elsewhere as well. And as we're talking about this, it's important to remember that the word expressionism, if we think about it not as a movement, but as an approach to art, where you champion expression over objective representation. Right? You make an art where you're working on the expressive nature of illustration rather than the objective reproduction of the observed world. Right? That's what expressionism kind of means. Then you realize that basically expressionism has been everywhere in everything we've looked at in this class. Right? Expressionism is embedded in constructivism. Expressionism is embedded in suprematism. It's embedded in De Stijl. They all, when Mondrian writes about De Stijl, he talks about it as being an expressionist movement. When Malevich writes about suprematism, he talks about the pure expression of form. Right? Fauvism is a form of expressionism, right? The colors express, right? It's everywhere. And really in the early 20th century, probably one of the most important wide-ranging movements, right? Now, in Germany after the war, what we see with expressionism, writ large, right? Capital E expressionism, is that German art after the war, expressionism gets really bleak. It's difficult and sad, harsher. We lose the interest in creating a utopia out of abstraction, or Kirchner trying to create a bridge to the future. That's sort of gone. It becomes much more rooted in everyday life. And in a scathing critique of some of the activities that one sees in daily life. It's socially engaged. Now, I would argue that Kandinsky's socially engaged as well. You know, he's trying to make a better metaphysical world for us all, right? There's a social engagement there. But this is critique, right? Shine a spotlight on the evils of society in a hope that the art can change it, or at least help to change it, right? So George Grosz was, the reason for this change is the war, right? Long and the short of it, the reason for this more bleak outlook after the war is the war. Most of the artists that we will look at, in fact, I think all the three I'm going to show you from this movement, are served in the war. And each one of them came out of the war deeply scarred. And that deep scarring of the psyche is not something that's just unique to these three artists, but something that a lot of people in Germany were dealing with. Because after the war, you had veterans coming back, wounded and poor. And society, this wealthy Weimar Republic, doing very little to help, or so it seemed. Not enough, right? So society not looking after its neediest as well as it might. If it sounds a little contemporary, well, things don't change that much, right? So in this case, the words of the title, "I have done my part, the plunder is your affair," those are the words of the veteran. In the foreground, his leg in a cast, or it may even be a prosthetic, right? There on the side, his cane and his crutch, right? He has given his all. He has done his part, right? He went out, fought in the war, got hurt, so that fat people in furs can go out shopping, right? I have done my part. You plunder the economy. Right? This is a pointed social critique about the polarization of wealth in 1920s Germany. Right? The people who kept the country alive. Right? The people who fought in the war. And yes, they were our enemies, but look at it from their point of view. Right? The people who fought in the war are not being supported by the country that they fought to preserve. And the people who are being supported by that country are the people who chose not to, or figured out a way not to, fight in that war. Right? The fat cats. Okay. And Grosz, in this style, which is typical for him, which is very linear, you'll notice it's expressive, but not really at all abstract. Right? Everything is meant to sort of represent form and shape. He caricatures, but he doesn't remove it from recognizability in the way that Kandinsky might. Right? Simplifies it. But he is certainly using it to show us what is bad about society. These are very, very bleak works, right? They're very rarely joyous. One of our guys will be, but only from, not all the time, right? So, now, Grosz had actually served in the war. He enlisted in 1914 when the war broke out. Patriotic German, right? He enlisted in the war, But he was discharged in 1915 for medical reasons. He was injured, sent home, right? Then he was drafted again as the war drug on. So he's already done a tour of duty. He's already come home injured. And in 1917, he's called up again and has to go back to the war. This time, he has a mental breakdown while fighting, and he's discharged the second time. Mental trauma was rife in World War I. This is where we get the word shell-shocked, was first used in World War I, because it's trench warfare, right? It is literally hand-to-hand combat, right? In the trenches, in the mud, you can barely see over the edge of it. People stand up and they're dead, Machinery, and this is where, Jamie, your question from Friday, maybe it was last Tuesday, but last week you had a question about, this embrace of machinery and industry as a positive thing. This is going to be the group that sees it alternatively, because they saw airplanes not as some great spiritual elevation of the soul above the earth, but as the thing that delivered death, right? They saw tanks, right? They saw mustard gas. Imagine mustard gas, right? People running around in these masks, goggles, and looking like mechano men, right? Running through the landscape and killing each other at very, very close range. Modern warfare really doesn't do that much, right? Modern warfare, you push a button and somebody dies somewhere. We send drones now, right? We remove the fact that it's closer than I am sitting to Seth and James, It's hand-to-hand combat, bayonets on your rifles, right? Your last form of defense. And these people come back incredibly scarred, right? And Gross, after having served, these 2 tours of duty, and after having been discharged and hospitalized for trauma, right? Mental trauma, this led him to really hate war, obviously, but also led him to hate Germany. He really ended up detesting not Germany per se, but the whole idea of nationalism, because he'd gone out there and he fought for his country, right? And the idea of fighting for your country became to him a problem. The issue of killing somebody for the good of your country, right? Nationalism as a... Who was it that said that nationalism is the last refuge of scoundrels? Right? There's a famous quote. I think it's Jefferson, but I'm not 100% sure, right? Putting country before humanity, right? Putting country first is Gross came to see as being a huge problem. And when this happened, he changed the spelling of his name from the Germanic spelling, Georg Gross, with the S set, the German double S, to George, English-sized, and then getting rid of the S set in lieu of an SZ, which is what that symbol really translates into, right? He doesn't want his name to be particularly Germanic-looking. He would rather that it was more international-looking, right? And this was a outcome of his changed attitude toward his fatherland, right? Changed attitude toward Germany, right? So these prints that we're looking at, done in the 1920s, these I can't remember if these are lithos or engravings. I think they're lithography. Are all sort of taking on this idea. I had this up to illustrate something I've already mentioned, which is that this is a sea change from what Expressionism is like prior to the war. That there is a hopefulness and a utopian spirit and an idea of a future that is potentially rosy and bright prior to the war. And World War I just really kind of destroyed that, right? If we think about Kandinsky as a constructivist, it brought him back down to earth. Construction, right? Teaching at the Bauhaus. Works that became sort of more articulated. But for Gross, he represents this new trend, right? Toward a new kind of expressionism, one that's focusing on the here and now, on social justice, right? And often very bleak. Now, there was no term for this when artists started working in this direction right around 1919, 1920. But in 1925, there was a big exhibition of modern German expressionism, the contemporary stuff since the war. And the curator of that exhibition coined a new term. Seeing this difference from old expressionism, right, the utopian stuff, the abstract stuff that pointed to a metaphysical world, and the shift to now a modern expressionism that points to this world that we live in, right? The term that he coined for it is new objectivity, right? Objective world around you becomes the focus, not some spiritual idea of what it should be or could be. And in German, Neue Sachlichkeit. Don't worry, new objectivity is plenty, right? But you're doing readings on this, you'll come across the term. And you should know sort of that's when you might find an author that drops Neue, and you don't have to say it out loud, right? Neue Sachlichkeit, new objectivity. And it's this new trend of German art after the war, a German art that is focused on the world around us, the evil of the world, and hoping that by shining a spotlight on it, people will recognize the injustice and move toward change. Right. So another print from roughly the same time on the left. Let's try to read the print. They all have these sort of literary titles, and usually in quotes like that, right? And many of them seem to come out of various older theatrical traditions. The actual quotes do, not the images themselves, but the words. So let's look at this. What's going on here? Under my rule, it shall be brought to pass. What do you think he's trying to get across with this? Who's under whose rule? What's going to be brought to pass? James.
I would guess that that's like the dictators in Germany.
Yeah. That's exactly right. The kingpins, right? And you can tell, right, that they are because look at the way the one that's facing us is dressed, right? Nice tie, right? Three-piece suit, second set of lapels on the vest, handkerchief, vest pocket, right? The two in the foreground, smoking, right? What's his attitude toward them? Sorry, say it louder. He does not like them. How do you know, Hunter? They're ugly-ass people, aren't they? I mean, they're fat, right? Not just heavy. But they're uglier than all get out. They all have that same sort of broken, they look like they're ex-boxers or something with those hooked noses, right? Sneering, right? I always thought, by the way, that Georg Gross must be the guy that Mike Judge used for Beavis and Butthead, right? There's something about the face. There's a way when you see enough Georg Gross or George Gross, you start to think, oh, yeah, that's exactly, because they all have these kind of big heads and these bodies, and they walk around sort of stiffly. So, okay, so under my rule, it shall be brought to pass. Now, what shall be brought to pass? What's going on in the picture? Let's just, instead of the title, let's just think about what's going on in the picture. Margaret.
Well, there are guards in the background with some type of factory. And
That's right.
all of these poor-looking citizens are huddled in the middle.
That's right, so they can't leave, right?
Exactly.
Right, so we have factories in the background, and the factories are guarded. So, now, are they keeping the people out of the factories or keeping them in? Right, the factory yard is a question, right? But certainly there's this idea of prohibition of movement, right? Containment of that group of citizens. And you can see that the one facing us, the ugly man with his body facing us, is sneering over his shoulder at them, right? So his attitude toward them is these are just the riffraff, right? They're the ones that are in the way. Now, you said a bunch of poor people. Can we be more specific than that?
Tattered clothing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a kid that has no leg and is on crutches.
Is that a
Looks like
kid?
no leg.
Does anyone want to help out? What, the person on crutches, who is that? It's a veteran, exactly. Look at his hat.
Oh, yeah.
He's a soldier, right? He's not, in other words, he's not a kid. He's just rendered at a different scale,
Okay.
right? But he's missing a leg, right? Isn't he? Does he have like one
Yeah,
leg, I
he's
think,
only-
right? And he's on
yeah,
crutches,
like-
right? He looks kind of like an older man, but he's right next to that tiny kid with the old lady. Now think back to Katie Kollwitz, right? She's not the bleakest of our pre-war expressionists, right?
Including widow and child.
Right, well that, and also remember the series of prints that she did of the milliners, right? The people that were working in the shops at the very beginning, and the mother with the dead child there, right? And this idea of depicting an older person with a youth next to them is a long-standing way of showing the degree to which this work doesn't lead anywhere, right? This work only leads to more work. That we in America are so used to this idea that hard work will, you move up the ladder through hard work. But Gross's point here is that hard work is a lifetime indemnification, right? Lifetime job. And that kid's got nothing to look forward to except to be like the mom. So what's going to come to pass? Social order as they see it, right? Workers who are conscripted to work and stay poor, while they who do not work get rich, right? And you can see in the foreground that's quite obviously the case. Bundles of money waiting to go to the bank or just come out of the bank, right, with the ribbon around the bills, but also stacks and stacks of coins, right? So, under my rule, under the rule of these aristocrats, right, this society shall come to pass, a society that benefits them and them alone. Right? So, pointed social criticism. This is what new objectivity is all about. Are these images that reground us in the world that we can see, and do so in a way that they hope to affect social change. Again, it's been up there, so there, Jamie, that's how you spell Weimar, right? The Weimar Republic, which is the first German government after the war, really only lasts for a dozen years or so, right? It's replaced by, this is what's overthrown by the Nazis, is the Weimar Republic, right? Let's see what's coming up next. Right. I think I cut a bunch of stuff here, so we're going to go. This is difficult. Sorry, guys. Next couple slides are pretty ugly. Murders of prostitutes became a theme in German art right around 1920. And we've seen prostitutes in modern art kind of frequently, right? Turning to shining a light on the life of the prostitute as a way of sort of talking about what's modern about the modern world. So, the first day of class, we showed Manet's Olympia, right? We saw Picasso's Young Ladies of Avignon, right? Various others throughout that's come back again and again as a theme. In this case, it's rather disgusting. It's incredibly violent. Again, the life, in this case, the death of a prostitute. And the idea that this murder of one of society's less well off, an element of society that people would rather not look at, right? Decent folk don't pay attention to them. But they're human nonetheless. And their murders should be investigated as any others might. Right? And the whole term, lust murder, the German term, was actually recently coined by, I don't know if this, Krafft Ebing was a psychologist, came up with the same one who coined the term sadism and masochism, right? Also, lust murder, a murder that is inspired by sexual arousal. Murder as an outlet of sexual arousal. So this poor prostitute has been beheaded. We don't even know where's her head, right? Is that guy in the back the murderer? I think he probably is meant to be, right? He's got his suspenders off. He's trying to wash his hands of the affair. And what Gross shows us in the foreground is this mutilated body of the prostitute. Now, he's not, I don't think, as much worried about whether or not prostitutes were actually killed in 1920s Germany as he is using this as a metaphor for the injustices of society as a whole. And a very violent one at that. Now, the next one by his colleague is even worse, I think. Otto Dix, another of these lust murder images from the same period, and there are others out there as well. I brought these in because we don't have that many things by Gross or Dix to show you from local collections. So I'm sorry that it's so vile, but again, both of these works function in the same way, using this incredibly revolting image to shock you into acknowledging the injustices in society, right? Now, with Dix, right, we have alcohol involved, we have dogs. Yes, those two dogs are doing what you think they're doing down there. But again, it adds to the theme. It's weird in a way because on a certain level you look at it and you kind of giggle, and maybe it's like, okay, in horror films, right? There's almost always this like Evil Dead movies or something. There's always something where you go, right? And you look at it and you laugh, and it's a nice release of the tension, right? And you find that a lot in horror films, that there's these times where you're going to laugh, and you're supposed to laugh, right? In Get Out this summer, right, when he runs him through with the deer head, it was kind of funny in a way, even though it was kind of gross at the same time. That, I think, is this visual corner that you can go to get away from the horrors. But like Gross, he's, again, a post-war artist very much damaged by the war and sees society rather in a negative light. Otto Dix had been a machine gunner in the war, right? When he was served, he was actually running a machine gun. And his experiences there, mowing down people on a regular basis, turned him into a very ardent social critic. And he sees these lust murder images, like I said, as an indictment of all society. We can do this to each other, right? I've said this to you guys before, right? When we talked about Franz Marc, I talked about the fact that when we have this saying, he's behaving like an animal. But animals don't behave like that. That's behaving like a human. And the indictment is, how can we do this to each other? Which, coming out of the war as a machine gunner, using the most forward-thinking technology to more efficiently kill your enemy. Put Dix, put Gross into this mindset where they want to say, we as humans have got to be better to each other by showing the absolute horrors that we can inflict, right? Animals don't kill for pleasure, right? Animals kill because they have to eat, We do that. We just lose right on that. We don't behave like animals. We behave like humans when we do this, and it's a horrible thing, right? He used his experiences in the war to do a 50-print series simply called The War that he issued in 1924 to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of the start of World War I. And by commemorate, right, we usually think about commemorations as being sort of celebrations of sort, right? But he wants to memorialize it. He wants us to think never, ever again. So he uses his experiences, the things that he saw while fighting in the war, as the basis for 50 different images of soldiers during the war. And as you can see with this one, it's equally horrifying. That's a soldier with his back to us about to rape a nun. Right? He's pulling her knees apart. Can you read it now in the darkness? Right? We have to explicate this. Right? She's fighting against him. She has her hand on his head. She's pushing him away. His view of the war is not at all celebratory. You can have images of war, which is like, yes, we fought and we won, and aren't we heroic? Never shows up. Right? There is no upside to this in Dix's mindset. Right? War is hell. And he's going to show us exactly what it is, so that, unfortunately, but in the hopes that it would never happen again. Right? In fact, there was a movement in the 20s called Never Again War in Germany. Nie wieder Krieg, right? Never war again. Obviously, got pushed out of the way, right? By World War II. So here's Dix's image. these are both intaglio prints, primarily dry point. I think he likes the dry point because what dry point does, for those of you who haven't taken Mary's class, right? When you make a dry point, it's a piece of metal, and you drag, so it's sort of like etching, right? Where you're going to carve the lines that hold the ink, okay? But the way you do it is without the acid. You just take the plate and a steel needle and you start to scratch it. And the deeper the scratch, the darker the line. And what happens with a dry point, this is my plate, right? Here's the bottom of it, right? That's my plate. If I carve with a dry point, I get the piece of the hole that I cut where I put the ink. But what happens is the metal that used to be here will kick up over here, kind of like a plow when you furrow a field, right? You get the groove where you put the seeds, but you get this mound of earth next to it, okay? So you get this little hunk of metal here that hangs on to the line, and when you put the ink on it, it'll hold in there, and it will gum up around over here as well, give you this kind of fuzzy, dark line. And you can see these directly above the bed, right? Here, these are dry point lines, right? And if we think about the way you make a dry point, now, Mary's got you doing it in plastic, right? Easy, easy. But imagine if you're drawing metal to metal. You're stabbing it, and you're ripping at it, right? And I think that for Otto Dix, as well as for Gross, this allows them to sort of channel the violence of the image, so that the technique that he's using has a direct impact on the meaning of the work, right? That you wouldn't get the same effect if it were a lithograph, or a drawing, or a watercolor painting, right? You might get more color, the blood might look bloodier, but this technique amplifies the meaning, right? On the right, also dry point, but it's using aqua tint that allows them to get that dark tone. Another process, you put resin on the plate, you heat it up, it forms a surface, you etch it, and that gives you nice deep dark tones like that as well. What he's looking back to for his inspiration on this is the printmaker Goya from the late 18th, early 19th century. Did a whole series of prints on the French and Spanish War, right, during the during the French occupation of Spain. So, historically speaking, for Goya, right, Napoleon's, first the people of Spain rose up against their king, Ferdinand II. And Napoleon, across the, Pyrenees, thank you, our French professors. Across the Pyrenees, Napoleon offers Ferdinand refuge and says, I'll send my troops in to help you with this uprising. And Ferdinand says, great. And what Napoleon does is lock him up and take over and colonize Spain as part of his idea of bringing all of Europe under one rule, right? And during that time, there were a series of uprisings against the French troops, against the Napoleonic troops in Spain. Goya was there through the entire thing and witnessed it, right? Guerrilla. This is where we got the term guerrilla warfare, right? The guerrilla, the little war, guerre, guerrilla, right? Guerrilla warfare came from this war between Spain and France. And so what Goya did during the war was to do a series of prints that he's going to eventually issue. In fact, he never does, interestingly enough. They're only ever printed after he dies, but he shows the horrors of war. There's something like 70 of these that show terrible things that happened during the war. And these are the inspiration for Dix. He's going to offer us a modern version of this. He, too, witnessed war firsthand. Goya wasn't a soldier, right? Goya was just a citizen watching this guerrilla warfare in the countryside. Right? He was deaf, too, stone deaf. And so he's literally witnessing it, not hearing it, but just seeing it, right? Dix was in the battlefield, saw these things firsthand. Goya is his primary inspiration. And we know that because many of the themes are picked up. So in this case, they do not want to. Goya always has these elusive titles, right? They do not want to. They don't want to go with the Cossack, right? With the mercenary soldier. And they're fighting against him, but he's obviously probably going to win out because he's stronger than they are, right? And where is he going to take them off to? Well, it's a safe guess, right? That basically he's heading here, right? He's taking them off for nasty things in the night, right? So this is Dix's primary inspiration are the works of Goya. Sorry about the Goya on the left. He saw these things, right? They're really horrific. But one of Dix's most famous images from the war is this image called the Dance of Death, the year 18, right? Anno 18. In other words, the Dance of Death in 1918. Now, what he shows is the utter carnage on the front, bodies just stacked and wrapped and tied into the barbed wire along the front. And again, it's about the senselessness of it all, right? The inhumanity and the senselessness of it all. Calling it the Dance of Death, and this will get rid of that Goya for us, right? He's basing it on, again, early German printmaking. Such an important thing for our expressionists. Hans Holbein's Dance of Death was a series of prints he had done in 1525, showing how death comes to everyone. But what Holbein did was to give us a skeletal figure of death. It's some outside force, right? That comes and visits the rich man, takes his money from him. Comes and visits the queen, right? Is going to take her off, holding up the hourglass on the right and dressed like a jester, right? But for Otto Dix, there is no outside force. It's us, right? The dance of death is caused by man himself, not some supernatural force that has come back to take us away. Right? So again, these are incredibly bleak images, right? And yet when we talk about expressionism, right, and we're going to narrow it down to one thing, this is usually what we think about, are these images intended as social critique and showing just how bad we can be to each other. Now, our last artist from this group, from the Neue Sachlichkeit, the New Objectivity, is Max Beckmann. For my money, I mean, most people will agree that he's like the best of the group, by far. And all of these people, by the way, did paintings as well. Gross painted, Dix painted, Beckmann did as well. But we have more of their prints here than we do other things. Like Gross, like Dix, Beckmann also served in the war. He was an ambulance driver during the war. So he was driving ambulance back and forth to the front, taking up bodies and taking them to the mobile surgical army hospitals, right, that had been set up to try to treat these things. And again, same basic story. Experience in the war disillusioned him. Seeing the effects of evil on the bodies of his fellow man, and seeing it close up because he's loading them onto the ambulance and taking them to the hospital, where hopefully we can try to keep them alive, right? Again, this led to a nervous breakdown. And this is not uncommon. This is not just sensitive artists, right? Many people had major nervous breakdowns during and after the war. And Beckmann, 1915, has a massive breakdown. Right? Now, he tells us about this image, the large operation. He said that he actually saw this. This was an operation room that had been set up near the front in Belgium. And in his expressive style, he wants to show us a sort of factual reporting of what happened there. So we see one of the injured men laying on his stomach on the right, being worked on by a nurse and a doctor. And on the left, we see another body being brought in, looking rather horrific, And the idea of one body coming in headfirst this way from the left and the other one arranged at a different angle going up gives it the sense that this is just going to keep happening. That you're going to bring him in as fast as you can, fix him as fast as you can, get him out of there, bring somebody else in. It's the never-ending parade of pain and suffering is what he's hoping that he will focus on, right? Everything is diligent. The orderlies are clean. It doesn't, nobody's neglecting these people, right? The nurse on the left going out with the pan. The man holding the front of the gurney looking over his shoulder to make sure the guy's okay. They're caring for them, right? It's not about medical neglect, but rather that despite that orderly diligence, right? Is there anything that we can really do to help? Because we're the ones who've done this in the first place, right? Now, some people have suggested, it's kind of hard to say, but you see the fellow back here, this one? Some people have suggested that that's Beckmann. Now, we have self-portraits of Beckmann, and maybe we'll see him in just, well, here. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Hang on. Bip. Bip. There's Beckmann's self-portrait. Yeah, I buy it. Right? The fellow in the back, I can see that. Granted, this is 7 years later. He may have had more hair back at that time. I know how that goes. But it definitely is intended as a witness, which Beckmann was, as a surrogate looking on and watching these horrors continue and continue as people are milling about. One of the things that Beckmann loves to do is to give us these really crowded scenes where, as it gets more crowded, it gets almost less personable. That each of the people, for all the crowdedness that he brings to the composition, each of the people is sort of contained in their own little space. And more or less divorced from the people around them, even though they're so close to each other. Does that make sense looking at this? That you get the sense that all of this crowding, that each one is going about their own thing in very, very close proximity to each other. And Beckmann loves that. Beckmann says, I'm finding out more about him now because I've always liked him, but I'm trying to figure out what it is that makes him click. And one of the things, so this is still kind of half-formed in my head, right? But one of the things about Beckmann that he's trying to do with these is, on a certain level, he shows us going about our daily lives, wherever that might be, and this overlaps with Dix and Gross and their interest in showing how horrible the war had been, right? But in addition to that, and what we'll see Beckmann do through his career is start to look at what does it mean to be alive? And how does that relate to the things that we do day in and day out, right? Because being alive is more than just our actions, isn't it? We'd like to think, right? That being alive is more than punching the clock, right? It's more than that our sense of being, our sense of self, our sense of soul and purpose, right, is more than just our job. And I think that we're getting somewhere with this, along that trajectory. They're going about their job, but each one of them has that self-containedness that suggests uniqueness, that suggests individuality, even as they work in tandem, right, to try to help. That each one has their sort of existential singularity, right? And that's something that we see in his works kind of frequently, is that interest in how we as people have an existence that's independent from the roles that we assume in day-to-day life. And say what you you will, about the violence of Dix's images, right? The social critique of Gross. All of them are interested in humanity, the humanity of each of us, right? That we have, that maybe we share, but we also possess individually. And they're reaching out to that sense of innate humanity in each of us. Right? Beckmann shares that. And what we'll see after the war, this is during, okay? So this is produced while he's, 1914, right? This is before he's discharged, okay? This is while he's serving in the war. After the war, the mood lifts a bit for him, much more so than Gross and Dix. And he produces a series of prints in 1921, 1922, where he sees the world around him as if it were a carnival. And he uses the carnival as an analogy for this thing I've been talking about, which is that there's more to life than our everyday activities. That we have these roles that we play. But there's more to being alive than playing that role. So this is the opening. There are 10 prints in this series, and this is the first print in the series of 10. And it's a self-portrait where he appears, I love his little cigarette, right? And you can see the dry point lines that make the smoke coming up off of it just here. But he's a carnival barker. Do you know what a carnival barker is? Step right up, right? Come and see the dog-faced boy, right? Come and see the half-chicken woman, right? That's what a carnival barker does. Gets you to, as you're coming along the midway, to come into that tent, give them your quarter, right? And see that freak show. Or whatever. It doesn't have to be a freak show, right? It could be whatever. Come on, get over here and 3 balls for a nickel. Knock the bottle off the shelf, right? That's what a carnival barker does. And that's what he is, carnival barker. And he's inviting us to the Circus Beckmann, right? Which I think is really kind of charming. And what a great relief from all this horrible lust murder stuff, right? And as he's leaning on his hand is subtly pointing this way. Because if you think about this in a book, right? This is issued as a portfolio of prints. So the idea is you're going to look past print number 1 and look at print number 2, and he's sort of saying, grab it by the corner here, guy. Turn the page. Let's see what's in here, right? Here he is, the carnival barker, inviting you to Circus Beckmann, right? And I only brought in one. I should have brought in the merry-go-round, because it's this really wonderful scene of people on this merry. I'll bring it in, because we're almost out of time. I'll bring it in next time. But here, so these were all based on the idea of, it's called the Jahrmarkt, the annual market or the annual fair, which most European cities have, right? An annual fair where everybody comes, goofs off. They still do this, right? When I was living in Ghent, there's this thing called the Ghent Festival, and it's just this crazy, drunken, like people just show up from all corners of Belgium, and they party all night, and every morning they're out there like spraying away the vomit, you know, and beer everywhere. Yeah, and Allie wants to go. And dancing and just fun, right? And the performances and it has, but I don't like crowds, and so but anyway, they're still doing it everywhere. It's not just like there. And so his idea is this is the annual, the annual market fair, and they developed from medieval traditions that had to do with pilgrimage and whatnot to see a saint, and they've been totally secularized. So in this case, behind the curtain is an acting troupe waiting to go on stage, right? So this is backstage at a theater production at night. I'm not quite sure why there's a bull looking in the window, but again, it's a market fair. They're probably selling produce as well. Think about county fairs, right? We have county fairs, right? And there's a pie baking contest, and there's a horse races, and people are bringing their best cows from the market to show off, and that sort of. And there'll be other things, right? The games and rides and, general fun, and people let their hair down. And what's interesting is you take off the role you play all the time, and you get to be you, right? That's what rest and play is really all about. In this case, he chooses actors, right, who have a role to play. But we see them behind the scenes. So we see them as people who definitely have to put on that role, but haven't put it on yet. And it raises this question of, okay, what is then life? Right? Is it the time on stage when we play the role, me here for an hour and 15 minutes, twice a week? Or is it the stuff that happens outside of that, when you're behind the scenes, right? And that seems to be the basic theme that he's working through here, right? Actors waiting to perform. He loves highlighting artifice in our lives, right? The actor behind the scenes, right? The connection between activities and mythologies. He loves that, right? And it's all about revealing who we really are, right behind the other stuff. So, this is part of that series of 10 prints. And I think I've got 2 minutes left, so I think I'll quit there, and then I can bring in the merry-go-round, right? So we're going to wrap up Beckmann. I got a couple of pictures to show you, paintings, to show you, and then we'll move on to Dada is our next thing. So the Dada worksheet is also due Friday, so you'll be able to just chat about Dada instead of me lecturing about it, because you guys will know everything there is to know about Dada by Friday, right? Right. Okay, have a good week, and we'll see you soon.